Hello, New Prospect family. Welcome to RTB 2021 for March 30th, 2021 on this Tuesday. I hope you're doing well, and I hope you've had a great week so far, this Holy Week. It's got some great text today. We've got John chapter 20. We've got Leviticus, starting the book of Leviticus. Yay! And that's Leviticus 1. Then we have Proverbs 17, and then Philippians 4. We're actually finishing up the book of Philippians today. So let's dive right in, and we'll dive right in with the book of Leviticus. So uh, every year, when people begin the process of reading through the Bible, and sometimes when they start, from Genesis and start try to read all the way through to Revelation, usually the place they stop, they may slow down in the passages on the tabernacle and in the book of Exodus, but usually where they stop is when we get here to Leviticus. And it is no doubt a challenging book, but let me encourage you in a couple of ways. One is that this is a book, I think, that establishes much of what we find even in the gospel itself. So when you think, one of the things I do to introduce this book to my classes is I'll ask them the question, well, what is the gospel? And they will, offer their various definitions, and I'll say, well, what are the key components of the gospel? And they'll say things like, well, holy God, God who desires to bring people near to Him, and yet there's the sinfulness of humanity, the need for sacrifice, the need to live in holiness even after God has brought salvation. And guess what we find in the book of Leviticus? All those things, all those themes that become very essential for understanding what Jesus did for us and what the New Testament is all about, have their predecessors here in the book of Leviticus. So major theological themes in the Bible are found here. And I think what you'll find as you read through the book of Leviticus is that you'll see a lot of those core gospel themes being specifically, the groundwork for them is being specifically laid here in this book. But of course, with any book, really the key is understanding the original context, and it's understanding the original historical context and cultural context, but also the context and then in the literary structure of the Bible as well. And so in the next coming weeks, hopefully or next coming days, I'll give you some tools for interpreting some of those things. Now, let me deal with one major issue that I think is perhaps the biggest issue for interpreting the book of Leviticus, and that is understanding it in light of what just happened. In fact, Leviticus is intended to be connected to the book of Exodus. In the Hebrew text, you'll read that the title of the book is actually the very first word in the Hebrew text. It is, and he called. Now, in Hebrew narrative, that's the way they connect continuous narratives together. They have it by what we would translate as an and. It's in Hebrew, it's what's called a vav consecutive. And if you have a narrative, you will often see vav consecutives strung together. So if you're reading about Moses, it might say, and Moses did this, and Moses did that, and then Aaron did this, and Aaron did that, and so on and so forth. Well, this text begins, and he called. And he called. Well, that means if it's connected, if it's beginning with an and, it means it's connecting with something that came before. And what came before, of course, is the Exodus, the tabernacle, and all the events of, and of course, the covenant at Mount Sinai, all the events of the book of Exodus, God forming a covenant people for himself, bringing them to himself at Mount Sinai, giving them covenant instructions, and then agreeing to live with them. And of course, Leviticus is kind of expounding on that whole theme of how are they now in covenant, since they're in covenant relationship with God, how are they now going to live? What we've been preaching on for the past month or so in the Ten Commandments series I just completed, how shall they then live? And so much of what we find in the book of Leviticus is about, well, how do you live in relationship with God? And these first chapters in Leviticus, chapters 1-7, are about how do you approach a holy God? And that's always going to be through sacrifice. And so and we'll spend some time talking about the nature and significance of sacrifice in coming days as well. But all these things are based in that reality of who they are now as the covenant people of God. And so some really important things that you'll be reading about here in Leviticus. Let me just make one comment on the text for today, which is the text dealing with burnt offering or Holocaust offering. This was the most common offering of the Jewish people. It's one of the sweet aroma offerings They go before God, and this is something that recognizes ultimately something that God has already done in granting them forgiveness, and yet they by making this offering recognize that this is a identification with this offering that's being burnt up before the Lord, an identification of their sin before God as a covenant people. And so this is a significant offering. It's to kind of pave the way, I guess, for that access to God. And so, of course, if you look at this through a New Testament perspective, we have our once for all sacrifice in the person of Christ that gets us that access to the Heavenly Father. So, a lot of stuff on Leviticus. I could talk a lot more, obviously, and we will in coming days. That moves us to Proverbs 17, and I just want to hit on a few things with Proverbs this day. And, it's always good as you're reading through a chapter of Proverbs. Again, it's going to be a lot of different topics that are dealt with. In this chapter, you've got the foolish person and the wise person and the righteous person and the wicked person and the one who's restraining his words and the one who is not, and these types of things. It's always good to kind of pay attention to those character traits of what is being commended and what is not being commended. One of the things that always strikes me, though, is that some of the character traits are, in fact, character traits. They're not exactly things that we actually do, but are things that are internal that the author of Proverbs pays attention to. So one of my favorites is Proverbs 17:22, where it talks about the joyful heart is something that's being commended as good medicine, and the crushed spirit dries up the bones. Well, how many times have we seen this even in our own lives, where having good attitudes, having joy in our hearts, which ultimately for us as believers comes from having the joy of Christ in our hearts, is something that actually helps us to be ultimately healthier, and yet it's good medicine not just for our bodies but for our souls as well. And so pay attention to some of those things as you read through the book of Proverbs. That brings us to chapter 20 of John. And John here is detailing the resurrection, what we'll be celebrating on Sunday. So this is a beautiful text. It speaks of course, Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene, appearing to his disciples, and ultimately to Thomas. It also details in this chapter the purpose of the book that we've been referring to really throughout the whole entire our time in the Gospel of John, where John says, Jesus did a whole lot of stuff, but these things I've written to you, verse 31, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing you may have life in his name. And more than any other event in the book of John, this is what should spur that belief, right? That Jesus is the validated by God Son of God. And that is, of course, the resurrection. It was God's stamp of approval on his ministry and on Jesus's ultimate identity, that he is that Son of God. And I find it fascinating that right before that statement of what John is trying to communicate to us of who Jesus is, we have that story of Thomas, who is struggling with unbelief. And he says, unless I put my hand into his side, I will never believe. And yet Jesus says, and here I think this is a purposeful statement that John includes, he says that, have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. This is kind of the point that John has been driving at throughout the whole entire gospel. We have not seen, though we trust in the fact that it did happen, the resurrection of Jesus, and yet we have believed. And because we have believed, John says, you have life in his name. It's a beautiful text, isn't it? And what a thing to celebrate this Easter week in this John chapter 10. And then we have one more chapter in John that we'll deal with tomorrow, and that brings us to our last chapter in the book of Philippians, which is Philippians 4, which is, I think, probably the most optimistic text in all the Bible, and it's written by a guy who's in prison. And I mentioned this the other day in my sermon, I believe, where Paul is writing these things about rejoicing in the Lord, even while he's in prison. And it's because he is focusing on whatever is true and honorable and just and pure and lovely and commendable. Ultimately, those things are embodied in the person of Jesus. By focusing on Jesus, that ultimately brings the joy. And so as the author of Proverbs talks about having joy in your heart, that's good medicine. Well, where does that joy come from? It comes from rejoicing in the Lord. And again, I say rejoice. Also mentioned on, I think in my sermon, about the idea of contentment and how Paul could be content in all things. He could do all things through Christ who strengthens him, and those all things are being content, even while he's in a Roman prison, even while he's facing the possibility of death. He can be content because he knows who he is in Christ. He knows who Christ is, and he has the joy of Christ in his heart. And that's something to aspire to even this day, and also to know that we can have on this day, March 30th, 2021. Hope you have a great rest of the day.